we're going to talk about the car makers. And I'm going to ask Marcus Rundgren-Liu on stage with me, because you're going to host this new session, What Does It Take for OEMs to Successfully Transition to EVs? And we've got a Mentimeter for that one. So if you're here, please answer the questions and just, do you agree or not? Are legacy OEMs moving fast enough, you think, to keep up with the EV transition? Interesting question, I think.
It is, definitely.
And let the people think and give answers to that. Yeah, and a German one, yes. They are always the fastest. So, I leave you to this with this information. Good luck with the panel, and
thank you so much.
Enjoy.
All right, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to the next session. We're moving up in the value chain all the way to the OEMs. I think it was a great transition from the previous, or segue from the previous panel, where they ended with that it's not just batteries, it's much bigger than that. And of course, for the OEMs, it is much bigger than just that, even if batteries, of course, is a cornerstone. So we're seeing the largest transformation in the automotive industry in over a century, of course, and one driven by regulatory shifts, evolving consumer demands, and the urgent need for sustainability. And to kick off this session, we have a keynote from Wahid Hossein-Ali, who's director at SP Global. So please help me welcome Wahid.
Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. So allow me today to share with you some insightful data for S&P Global Mobility that will really bring some added value to our panel discussion today. Before we look into some forecast data, allow me to start with some historical actuals looking at the BEV market share. Starting on the left-hand side, we have the global market share, and year over year, we have great growth. Perhaps you could look into this trend and you could see from 2022 the subtle slowdown that occurs. And as we start to dive into this data and we look to the right-hand side, you see a different story begins to emerge. We have robust regulatory frameworks that have supported subsidies, incentives that have helped support the rollout of BEVs. And within these three major markets, it's only really China that's started to enter the mass adoption phase and has stretched over that chasm between the early adoption phase and that mass market. Looking at Europe, however, we had that beginning of a slowdown in 2023, but most concerning to this market is really the contraction that we saw in 2024. And really, I want to delve in and understand what are the drivers behind that, and perhaps to see what consumers can see and feel from this. So with our consumer survey data, we speak with both EV intenders as well as previous owners of EVs. For EV intenders, the primary concern remains price parity. The price of BEVs remains extremely high in a global perspective. Thankfully, it is improving over time, and OEMs are working to address this. They're bringing more entry-level BEVs to the market to help get us to help us successfully transition to EVs. However, more concerning when we look at this consumer data is the sentiment around the charging experience, and it's actually worsening over time. So since 2022, you can see highlighted on the left-hand side, the consumers are increasingly getting frustrated with their overall charging experience. And I'm quite happy to have seen in this exhibition hall so many different charging solutions, part of that infrastructure. And as has been mentioned in earlier presentations, you really will be the heroes of this EV transition by developing and investing within these technologies. OEMs are also very well aware of the voice of the customer. They also do their workshops with these customers to understand what are the gripes that they face, what are the hurdles to mass adoption. And with our conversations with OEMs as well, within planning divisions, within product and marketing and engineering divisions, the same issues continue to arise. There's range, cost, and charging time. So what can we do to remedy this, and what has to be done to remedy this? So a very busy chart here. On the left-hand side, we start off with EV charger cumulative 2024 up until 2024. And I think what really strikes me looking at this chart is we can take China as a benchmark as getting into mass adoption phase. And the share between fast charging and AC is much higher than what we see as Europe as a whole. The share in China is actually quite similar to what we see in Norway. We're about 40 to 45% fast charging in those markets. And my question to all of us is, do we need to reach this golden ratio in order to have the mass adoption of BEVs? Moving on to price parity, some data from our price forecast. We can look into, we break down every vehicle by segment, by nameplate and powertrain level. We really build this from the bottom up. But we're still looking at a high level here. And there certainly is a story that emerges from this. China has reached price parity. And when you look and you dive into the segment analysis, it's actually cheaper to buy BEVs in particular segments. And the same story is true across the other markets as well. As we go into segments, there are competitive elements around BEVs that exist. However, China has really started from the bottom up in terms of segments. They've started with smaller BEVs, addressing affordable BEVs to the market, whereas Europe and US, North America, has mainly been focused on premium BEVs, larger vehicles, rather than the entry levels, maintaining some sort of profit. As you can see, that buffer is quite large between ICE-based vehicles in Europe and plug-in hybrids and BEV. So we start to get into the forecast data, and I brought this in to kind of ask the question around range anxiety. And we've seen previously that there's been some examples of very large batteries being thrown into vehicles to try and remedy this problem. And we've learned from that it really does not solve the issue. If you keep on adding mass to that vehicle, you ultimately increase the consumption. So looking into our forecast here, looking at the average battery capacity, you can see that there is certainly some growth in the larger segments. There is a need to improve, and we'll see new technologies that will have more energy-dense, rich battery cells. But in the core segments, B, C segment vehicles, that growth is a bit more muted, and we have to consider that we need to address all of the market. There will be C segment customers who will be happy with 50 kilowatt hours, and there will be some that need maybe double that. And just to highlight the point around battery size and price parity, we have to find a balance. So if we think about price parity, we can get to the same price, but do we have the same vehicle? If I take an example of a Fiat Panda, an ICE Fiat Panda on a single tank of gas can easily achieve well over 500 kilometers. Now, if we were to put a battery pack like that to achieve that range in a Panda, I think we would price it out of the segment. So before I look at some really granular detail, I really want to take the high-level view. It's one of the massive benefits I think we provide our customers is giving the bigger picture. So our data sets go back from 2000, and we project 12 years at least within the production forecast. And you can see the total industry volume in the dashed line has faced its hurdles, right, in 2008 and in the pandemic in 2020. But from 2020, we start to see this, the emergence or the decline of this gray line and the growth of this blue line. So the gray line is any vehicle with an ICE on board, and the blue line is BEVs. And we can see from 2019 that you're never going to get back to those ICE volumes. So the trajectory is clear, but the forecast has changed. We work on the forecast monthly. We're able to implement impact events, intel all the latest narratives that fit around it, new regulatory frameworks. And the changes that we've seen in the past 24 months has really affected the crossover point here between BEVs and ICE. So it doesn't happen in this forecast, in the current forecast. We really are falling behind, and we're going to miss our targets if we don't act fast enough. So there's a lot to digest on this slide, and I appreciate that not everyone is familiar with our data. We have these are production regions, and it's the production share by propulsion type. So we have BEVs with the share mentioned in 2035, and the legend is there, and I'll point out a few. So we've got BEVs, range extenders, plug-in hybrids, and full hybrid vehicles. Now, interestingly, we've benchmarked China a lot and thinking about will we ever catch up with them, right? And in terms of volume, no. But our regulations are actually driving a bit biased towards one particular technology. So the only real decarbonizing technology that is effective in Europe is BEV. So although we reach a higher share of BEV in 2035 for Europe compared to China, if we include the range extenders and plug-in hybrids, that total NEV share is greater than what we have in Europe. We have emerging markets as well. I think we should pay attention to those because they will be important also to achieving affordable BEVs, as those key markets, Europe, China, and North America, might start to outsource in the future for lower cost vehicles. And perhaps a bit off the topic of the EVS, but it is certainly a trend in propulsion types that we're seeing globally, is the re-emergence of favorability towards full hybrid electric vehicles. And there's an appetite amongst OEMs to find perhaps this is the new standard of ICE. And I question myself and think and look at the gaps that we have between mild hybrid, ICE, that exist across the globe. And I wonder to myself, in the world of EVs, and we think about perhaps having two choices for the customers in a global context, perhaps we should do at least the baby steps and go to high voltage hybrids, and then we can have some commonality, some modularity between production and components of BEVs and hybrid vehicles. Well, I'm looking forward. This is my perspective, our perspective from S&P Global, but I'm really excited to hear from the panel as well, the experts that are going to join me on stage, and hear their perspectives as well. But I hope this data provides us the ground to give us credibility to our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, YG. And you will be joining us for the panel. Thank you so much for that global outlook. We will reinforce our panel and expand it with Boots on the Ground, with Raf van Nuff, who's Vice President of Product at Hyundai Motor Europe. We will also increase it with policy experts and strategy, with Maria Linkova-Nies, who's Executive Head and Policy and Strategy at Automotive Manufacturing
Association.
Well, a warm applause for our panel. Association. That was the word I was looking for. Sorry. But, all right. Before we start, could I maybe ask you to give just a minute to tell the audience a little bit what you do? I'll start with Maria.
It starts with me, yes. So Maria Linkova-Nies, European Automobile Manufacturers Association. So we are the voice of Europe's 16 largest manufacturers of passenger cars, vans, trucks, and buses. We're based in Brussels, and we represent the industry's view in conversations with European policymakers.
Nice to see you all. My name is Raf van Nuffel. I work for Hyundai Motor Europe. I hope the brand is known to most of you. Globally, we're the third largest OEM. That's then including the Kia brand and Genesis. But personally, I focus on the European scope. So I'm head of all the product and pricing activities. That also includes market intelligence and strategic planning to also achieve targets in terms of CO2 and other regulation.
And of course, I'm Roger Hossanali from S&P Global, and we provide data to our customers, stakeholders from governments, OEMs, tier ones, suppliers across the chain, anyone who needs to gather valuable insights into the industry. Of course, with the S&P name, we've really ventured out into the financial markets as well, so very interesting to hear the perspectives of that in the past few years.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's start. I think that the previous panel, that was great. It set the tone a little bit with one of the main components, batteries, of course. If we raise the bar a little bit and we go into the macro view and maybe start with policies. There's been, some stable policies both in Europe and in China, but unfortunately we also see some shifts in the North American market, the US market, for instance. Being said, what do you think? How does this impact OEM's ability to innovate and maybe scale EV production globally?
You certainly need certainty in regulations. If you don't have a clear direction, how do you invest into the right technologies? It's concerning that we see that kind of volatility in the US. And it's one of the things that I do actually appreciate very much about the EU is the fact that they've stuck to their guns on the target. So even with the amendment that's come for 2025, they've found a mechanism to both support the industry, protect jobs, but at the same time stay true to the overarching goals as well. And perhaps that works for 2025, but the discussion needs to be now about 2030 and 2035, because those challenges are immense. Yeah.
Maria, you're the voice for 16 of the largest manufacturers in Europe. What do you say?
Yeah, I think from the industry's perspective, it's not even the main problem is not say uncertainty. It's really the mismatch between the policy ambition and very ambitious goals, and the state of the enabling conditions to actually fulfill those goals. If we all, I think Mario Draghi in his competitiveness report, he really summarized it very succinctly, saying that the EU strategy for the automotive sector is an example of the climate policy that is not complemented by an industrial policy with no simultaneous synchronized push to convert value chains. And we've already heard in the previous discussion about battery value chain that this is, of course, one of the key issues. And I think the events of the past 18 months, the market development, which also I think Wojciech really outlined very well, the collapse or the slow growth of the market. We're still at the 15% for battery electric vehicles in Q1 2025. I think that really serves as a reality check for everybody to understand that this is not just about regulating vehicle supply, which is improving, and indeed more OEMs are bringing more affordable vehicles and more vehicles on the market. We have calculated that more than 300 models would be available between now and 2032. So vehicle supply is not an issue anymore, but it's indeed about the state of enabling conditions. Looking at the infrastructure, we all know the challenges of that. We have more than 60% of all recharging, refueling infrastructure in only 3 EU countries. And when it comes to, for example, infrastructure for heavy-duty vehicles, because it's not just about transformation of passenger cars, we're even in the worst situation because there's not even reliable data. We don't even know how many accessible recharging stations for heavy-duty vehicles exist in the EU. And incentives, the same situation, total cost of ownership, it doesn't still work for everybody, especially if you use public charging. So all of these enabling conditions, I think that there's now, they should be really in the spotlight, and this is where the direction now should focus on.
Yeah. Raf, Hyundai, you're one of the global major OEMs on a global level. You're on all the markets. So as a vice president of product, how do you synchronize this with your colleagues to product planning across such a fragment landscape?
Yeah, it is. I did mention I'm in charge of Europe, but you cannot ignore, of course, the global dynamics. So, for instance, US tariffs are hitting many brands. And obviously, if that means negative, bad news in the US, other regions will also be expected to catch up. So you cannot ignore you're part of this global politics as well. And we try to anticipate on that, and of course, picking up on the innovation. So I'd like to think we always keep on innovating ahead of the regulation, because that can give a competitive edge. But you need regulation to also make it economically viable. Yeah, you need the mass, and their regulation will enable us to also make it a business case that is viable, so we can invest again in future innovation. This is true for EV, but also for other things like autonomous driving and so on.
And so I'm bringing that back to the European market. Maria, so what's your view on the short-term flexibility granted to the OEMs between 2025, 2027, necessary safeguarding risk or backsliding?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's some perception in some circles that this is some kind of a gift to the industry, or it's an unjustifiable gift. I think that misses a little bit the point, because it's a step in the right direction. It was a necessary decision to avoid the European industry paying disproportionate costs of compliance for the failure of the market, which is, of course, outside of the control of OEMs alone. As we just, I think we all know that it's the enabling conditions that are also important to drive the market. And so this 3-year flexibility that has now been agreed is it's also the only way it's going to help, and it's going to put transition back on track, if in the same time also we double down on enabling conditions. And I know I sound like a broken record, and I already said enabling conditions a few times, but this is really a crucial dimension, because the way maybe to picture it very, very clearly is to think about the successful transformation as a kind of combination of 3 M's. One M is a mandate, targets, we have it. The second M is manufacturing, so competitive manufacturing in Europe to be able to produce affordable electric vehicles. And then the third M is really its markets, it's the incentives, it's all these conditions that make it a no-brainer for consumers and for businesses to buy zero-emission vehicles. So we need to have all these 3 dimensions into place, and we need to have equal attention given to all of them, not just to targets and mandates, to further progress on this journey. And there is no questioning, I think Raf can confirm it, there is no questioning among our membership about the direction. Everybody is committed. Hundreds of billions of investments have been done already. But the pace of the transformation will, of course, depend on a set of different factors, different external factors. And that's the conversation that we also need to have now with the European Commission.
Yeah. Raf, could you tell us a little bit about how Hyundai is committed to this? What type of investments have you done to meet the targets or compliance, maybe short-term, but you invest for a long-term strategy?
Yeah. But as Maria said, this average of 3 years, it's by definition, it's temporary. And it just offers a little bit of flexibility, because there's a lot of variables, of course. If demand fluctuates between markets, the level of electrification is so different that it's very hard to anticipate this. And 1 year is really short if you consider the life cycle of a product, or even the development stage of a new EV or any new product, by the way. And it's also fair, because you obviously very visible is that the target goes down to 93 gram, point something. What is maybe less obvious is that also the calculation of that target has been changing. For instance, the mass adjustment, it used to be a positive impact for heavier vehicles, meaning they had a higher target, an easier target. From one day to the next, as of this year, this became a negative impact. So all the heavier cars that in the past were actually a bit of a relieved, now all of a sudden get an extra penalty. And of course, for an industry like ours, it's very hard to make this shift very quickly back from bigger cars or heavier cars to the smaller, lighter cars. A second example is for plug-in hybrid vehicles. As of this year, for the new type approvals, the CO2 levels will at least double because of a new utility factor. And then again next year with Euro 7, another step of the utility factor will happen. So that also means the measurement of that target is changing rapidly. And for an OEM, we want to just have a fair treatment and make sure we can smoothly follow that path, basically to zero emission ultimately.
I'd just like to add that detail is so important, right, about within the regulatory framework, the change in the mass calculation, because for many years we were looking at the 2025 target, and within the Fit for 55 they didn't change the position for 2025. So we've known about a minus 15% for a long time, and I don't think we had anyone concerned about it 3 to 4 or 5 years ago. And it's only really as this detail has emerged from, as you said, it's flipped over one day, and suddenly the burden becomes so intense for those larger manufacturers. So we think about a minus 15%, but in reality for some OEMs it could be minus 30% from their targets in 2021. So often we have these superficial understanding of what the reality of what the OEMs face. It's a much tougher challenge than what it appears. And that's what concerns me thinking about 2030 is, yes, we've got the plans and the investment for vehicle platforms to underpin the volume that's necessary, but the market is entirely reliant on the subsidies, the incentives, in order to drive it. We can see in 2024, we see that contraction in Europe, for example, and if we remove Germany from that equation, we have positive growth in Europe. Now, what was the reason behind that? A removal of incentives from Germany. And the issue is that when we look into registrations this year, Germany is doing okay, but France is starting to lag behind. And so we look at these major markets, and we've heard this in other presentations as well, that we've got EU as a block, but we've got individual markets within that. And we need to think about the pace of adoption specific to those markets, because, okay, we're in here today in Sweden, a lot of renewable electricity, perhaps the affordability to make the transition, but across the entire European bloc, we need to recognize that there are going to be member states that need the support more so to make that transition.
Is it something that you feel the effects of? That Europe is into individual or not? I mean, it's one single market, but that we have different types of local policy and incentives on the different 27 markets.
It's very fragmented, yeah, because even if you remember the chart behind us on price parity, this would also we show one European average, but the reality is there is no European picture. Yeah, it could be much better in markets like Norway or Netherlands, where there is actually, from a government point of view, a taxation that actually does bring it relatively close to price parity. And then in other markets, we're even much further away from what the chart is showing. So this also, from an OEM, makes it more difficult to find the right balance, not just between powertrains, but also then between in which markets you're going to sell them. Yeah. So when we talk about EV, yeah, it is obviously in this round mostly about battery electric. But for us, for now, hybrid electric and plug-in hybrid electric is really key to manage this difference or these variables effectively. Everyone knows it's a transition technology, but the transition can be also quite long-term. Yeah, that doesn't mean it's a very short-term thing that will disappear. It's there for quite a longer time. So for now, it's key for us to also optimize what we do in terms of hybrid and plug-in hybrid business as well.
And Maria, your members, do you echo what Raf's been saying?
Well, we are, I think, as we all have seen the developments in the market, I mean, that clearly shows that we need a reality check, or maybe more pragmatic, flexible approach towards reaching the objectives. Again, nobody questions the target. We want to be climate neutral by 2050. So the what is not a problem, but the how, maybe there is now a room for a conversation and to see whether there could be an alternative, more flexible way of achieving the same target. And so the upcoming revision of the CO2 regulation, which is expected to start, well, it's already started. We expect a proposal either later this year or early next year. So that should be an opportunity to have this, I think, very sober assessment and honest conversation about the how.
Yeah. Okay, so policies being one of the many components that is driving the shift towards EVs. We also have, of course, customer preference and product design. So let's shift a little bit to the consumers. This is a question for you, Raf. What design trends are emerging in your EV production lineup, and how are consumers' expectations around lifestyle, tech, and comfort shaping the next generation of EVs?
Well, in terms of powertrain choice, not everyone can immediately jump into a full electric just because of limitation in terms of charging, for instance. So what I just mentioned on hybrid and plug-in is also, it's just looking at the reality and what customers are looking for, just to be able to meet that demand. From Hyundai point of view, for our local factories, so we produce in Europe, in Czech, but also in Turkey. There we make sure we actually can produce in one factory a combination of ICE still, and ICE can also be mild hybrid, full hybrid as well as battery electric. So this is one element to ensure that we have the flexibility to also proactively make shifts in powertrain. Apart from that, we see actually the more fluidity between segments. I mean, as OEM, we like to think in boxes, segments, powertrains. I think between segments, definitely there's a lot of fluidity. People are looking for a certain package. And with an EV, actually, a battery electric, then this package can be more efficient, meaning you can have a lot of interior roominess without having to grow the exterior dimensions. So I think this is quite key in meeting the expectations from a customer in terms of cabin space and trunk. Mm-hmm. And at the same time have a quite efficient package still. So this, I think, is a nice example of where our efficiency can meet also the requirements of a customer.
That's good. I mean, and in your presentation, we also saw that price point, of course, being very important. And I mean, the difference between the Chinese market, for instance, and the European and US market. That strategy in focusing on premium cars.
It's quite interesting where you see a market, an addressable market. For US and Europe, Tesla has really been a major driver to making the EVs cool, to make it kind of widespread, building out an infrastructure, kind of setting the grounds for, it certainly has helped the OEMs to kind of finally, I think OEMs had been making EVs for a decade before. It's not a new thing. And a century ago, we had EVs as well, right? But the approach in China was certainly different, and the regulations supported that. It also helps their overarching energy transition perspective as well, thinking about energy security. So there's very, very much different drivers for the regulators thinking about what they need to protect. And that feeds into OEM strategy as well and what you deliver. So, you know, incentivizing registrations in Shanghai, for example, of small BEVs, it enables you to drive. It's the only vehicle that would be allowed for certain years to be driven. Whereas in Europe, I think we had this Tesla effect, and then really from 2020, post-pandemic, it's a really bizarre time to look at because we have reduced volumes and we have successive crises happening. So pandemic, chip shortages, Ukraine-Russia conflict. Europe went through, and globally we went through, really hard to kind of digest trends from that time period because we have lower volumes and we have disproportionate or unusual consumer behavior in that period. From 2023, I think we kind of revert back to normal a bit. So we see that pent-up demand of ICE vehicles surging, and we see the overall global industry kind of recover in that time frame. But the issues persist, right, in the electrification in terms of cost here. Whether we have a suitable product for Europe. So it's quite interesting looking at segments as well. In China and US, generally towards larger vehicles, D, E segments, pickup trucks in the US, full size, whereas in Europe, it's B and C segment vehicles. But the way that we use those vehicles is very different. So journey distances, average journey distance in China compared to US, polar opposites. Europe perhaps somewhere in the middle there. But you'll see such variety, right, with a B segment vehicle, someone who does, hundreds of kilometers in a day, and the other person who's just sitting around the city. So we need to find suitable products for the customers, but I still do wonder about European usage of small vehicles in the whole.
I want to let Raf in on this one as well. I mean, price points being so important. Of course, I bet this shows up in your sales numbers on the different European markets.
Yeah, I mean, price parity would, of course, support a lot the growth of EV. But the cost of the product, it was also mentioned by someone in the previous session, if I remember well. We cannot ignore the cost is there. Luckily, in terms of material cost of the battery, the trend is in our favor. Yeah, we saw the cost per kilowatt hour now going down. So this does help, of course, to bring down the cost. But it will take a bit longer time and also more economies of scale, so bigger volumes, to achieve ultimately that price parity.
I mean, Maria, looking at the other markets, the US, for instance, or the Chinese market, but especially the US, they had a federal subsidy for this. Should we have something similar to this on the European market, that every country should have the same?
Yeah, I mean, definitely we fully support all kind of incentives. So, of course, this is a prerogative of each member state to have fiscal and purchase incentives. But we definitely need those incentives, and we need them to also be consistent and to have certainty that they will continue. Because as we saw last year with the withdrawal of subsidies in Germany, with the reduction of subsidies in France, it has an immediate impact on the market. So the market is not mature yet to just have this self-sustaining progress. It needs to be propped by incentives, and it's not just about money. It could be also non-monetary incentives. For example, zero-emission zones in urban areas, which is really beneficial to drive demand for commercial vehicles. Also, for example, procuring 100% zero-emission vehicles by governments, by municipalities, by cities. Again, we see great examples, I think, here in Norway, in Sweden, in the Nordics. But again, if you go elsewhere, this is still not the case. So yes, absolutely yes to all kind of incentives. And indeed focus on incentives, not on targets or penalties or mandates, because as we see, it doesn't really work, because the market is still too nascent to just develop on its own.
Yeah, I see now that time flies. So I want to leave the audience with one lightning round from each of you. So what is the single most important success factor for OEMs to lead the EV transition by 2035? One thing.
I'd say in financial support at the moment. I think the OEMs have got the plans, they've got the ambition to make that transition. Consumers and the industry both need the support to make that transition, and we need to value it.
Thank you.
Externally, I follow that in terms of government support. Internally, I think vertical integration of the value chain will be a key differentiator. So we already started, I mean, since a long time, we own our own logistics chain and our company. All our steel is also owned by us, steel production, I mean. And of course, it goes way beyond that. I mean, the battery is, of course, then the key differentiator in all of this. But I think there it will be the big difference between success or no success.
Thank you. Maria.
Yeah, for me, it's really bridging this gap between the goals and the policy ambition and actually the implementation and the signal that policymakers send to the industry and the implementation of enabling conditions at each member state level.
Great. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me give a warm applause to our panel.